Hello! At the last bank holiday weekend I managed to bag a few days over at Workshop 2. Because the summer here, like most places, has been really hot, my wife fancied an American style screen door to keep the bugs at bay, and I thought it would be quite a simple, cheap project. But when I came to price up the materials, it was going to cost me round about €150, which is probably about £150 or dollars. There doesn't really seem to be much difference at the moment. I thought I would make this from inch by 2. An inch by 2 at my local DIY shop is around about €6 a linear metre. Then I remembered I'd overbought on my tile battens when I put the terrace roof on a few months ago. So I wondered if I could use this material. After all, it was less than €1 a linear metre, but boy is it rough and unregularised. So let's see if I can utilise this wood, and whilst I'm at it, let's see if I can complete the project with zero spend. Now, for a bloke who spends a lot of time making benches on YouTube, I don't actually have a proper bench here yet, so I'm using 2 trestles and a ladder. I have adapted the saw base and a stop so I can use the ladder in this format. And once I got everything dialed in, it was a case of cutting the 2 longer and straighter pieces that would make the outer door frame, as well as the sill and the head. And because the walls are a little irregular, I just used the head to make sure that the frame was going to fit into the hole. Now, I don't have a thickness plane here, so it's a case of regularising the timber the best I can with my handheld planer. This was a noisy and laborious process, but it was worthwhile spending that extra time doing this. Now, typically one of the long pieces broke on a knot just as I'd finished regularising it, and as I didn't have a replacement, I had to come up with a method of repairing it. So here I'm setting my saw up to cut a scarf joint to join 2 pieces back together. Back over at my makeshift ladder bench, it was just a case of finessing the joint until it fitted properly. Then, using some wood glue, screws and clamps, fix the joint together and leave it for a while for the glue to set. It was nice to do all this under the supervision of Gracie the Vizsla. I've not seen her for a few weeks whilst I've been in the UK working, and she's been sunning herself at Workshop 2. And for some reason, whilst I was doing this, a large spider decided to jump into the glue to commit suicide. Once the glue dried, it was a case of removing the clamps and then marking out the new length of this piece and cutting it over at the saw. Right, now I'm back to the pieces that I need, and to join them together initially I put a pocket hole screw with my small Craig jig into each end. This jig is much cheaper than the larger version I have in the small loft workshop, but it's still very versatile. Now it's just a case of taking the 4 components over to a flat surface and screwing the casing together. Using some scrap plywood, I made some gussets over at the miter saw. First of all, these gussets will reinforce the joints, and secondly, it's a great way to get the word gusset into your video. Yes, I'm that childish. All this work has made me hungry, and this year's been a great year for our fig harvest. Although I have noticed there seems to be a real distinct lack of wasps this year. I don't know whether that's got something to do with the drought-like conditions. Fig trees need wasps, so I don't know whether next year's harvest will be poor. Okay, let's get back to our gussets. These are glued and screwed on all 4 corners, and once I'd partially fitted the first 2, I made sure that the casing was totally square before screwing the rest down. And once this was done, it was a case of giving the door frame an heavy sanding with some 80 grit and then running a chamfer bit down the inside of the frame. More on why I did this later. Okay, now to make a start on the door part. The timber is prepared in exactly the same way, and now I have my casing, I can use that to establish the length of my pieces of timber before cutting them at the miter station. And as the casing, I'm using pocket hole screws to initially hold the frame together. And to assist while I'm screwing this together, I use a sash clamp. I fit a middle rail in exactly that position, the middle. Use the clamp to hold it whilst I screw it in place. Let's make some more gussets. Here I'm making 6, 4 for each corner and 2 for the middle rail. And these are made out of some offcuts of 12mm plywood. Because I have the door casing made and it's square, I can clamp the door frame into the casing whilst I fit the gussets. And the method of fitting them is exactly the same as before, i.e. glued and screwed. The gussets on the middle rail are slightly bigger as they need to take the cross bracing that will stabilise and hold the door square in use. And here is the door fully gusseted up. Because I'm working with relatively poor quality wood here, when I'd applied the stain the previous day, the grain had really raised, so I knocked the whole thing back with some 100 grit. I also sanded the door and made sure that it was square. Okay, time to mark out and cut the diagonal bracing. And each end was marked and cut individually with my trusty Irwin tenon saw. Irwin have still not taken the bait and sponsored my channel. Shame. Once all 4 ends was cut, it was just a case of gluing them in place, and I felt confident in the fact that my joints were tight enough to turn the door over without them falling out. And then I screwed them in through the plywood bits. I'm fed up of using the G word now. And then just ran the router with a chamfer bit in to ease the edges. Finally, to finish the door and casing assembly, I just needed to screw this piece of plywood to the face of the frame. Moving on to the method to fix the frame to the house, I needed these 4 inch by inch cleats, which I sanded the corners off and pre-drilled some holes. And these were screwed at 3rd eyes to the framing of the outside door. As this day draws to a close, I'll leave you with the perfect sunset of the French countryside. To hang the door into the frame, I'm using these 2-part hinges that decouple easy so I can take the door off during the winter months when we're not using it. If you recall, when I made the frame, I ran the router with a chamfer bit up the inside of the frame. That was to make room for the knuckles of these hinges. In total, I'm fitting 3 hinges, top, bottom, middle. And once the hinges was on and working, it was time to take the whole thing to the back of the house to start the installation. I fitted the casing with 4 screws, 1 to each of the cleats I'd previously installed. The idea was that this would hold the framing tight to the back of the house and stop any insects from crawling around the periphery. Now the keen-eyed viewer may have seen that the door was slightly warped. So to get the door to fit correctly into the frame, I had to kick out the bottom left corner just so everything fitted nicely. It left me with a small gap that the critters could circumnavigate, but I would solve that problem shortly. But for now it was just a case of getting the door to fit and close properly in its casing. And because we're using fast grown pogue quality timber, I'm expecting that the door casing and the door frame will move around as temperature differentials change. Therefore I wasn't too concerned, as it may be a different fit next season. Okay, so let's make a couple of packers that will fit around the electric socket on the bottom left hand where the door casing is not quite fitted. I am making these packings out of some parquet floor that I bought really cheap a couple of years ago. I've used most of it, but it proved to be good quality timber, and it proved really economical to cut it down into inch by 2, inch by 3, etc. I also needed to box in the top by the fan light to stop bugs going over the top. For this I found some 6mm plywood, and if England are still looking for an opening bat, I still keep my eye in. Once I had all my secondary components, it was just a case of sanding and taking the edge off before giving them a coat of leisure. This is not my only project under construction. Slowly and surely I'm using all my spare rocks to build the outer skin of the terrace that I started earlier in the year. If rocks ever become currency, I will become an overnight billionaire. And once my components had dried, it was just a case of fitting the part round the socket, the part above the socket which closed the gap off up the left hand jamb, and then the paddle at the top. Now a few years ago we bought a length of what I call net curtain, but I'm told it's called voil, we use to make a fly screen for the windows, and here we're stapling a length to the back of the door. I'm sure there is proper fabrics for this use, but we're trying to do this with zero spend. Now it's just a case of hooking the door onto the frame. There, that will keep the beasties out. Oh no, one's got in already. The final part is to fit a spring closer to the door. That's why I put the packing on the casing to take the fixings. I had this spring closer in the small loft workshop and I brought it on the plane. There was much conversation to be had at airport security to decide whether I would be allowed to bring it onto the plane. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, so it was worth taking it to the airport to see, even though it could have been thrown out in the rubbish. And that's it, a screen door built at zero cost. And if nothing else, I will spend a few minutes every day playing concierge to Gracie. And the great thing about making projects here is nothing goes to waste. All the offcuts eventually end up on the wood burning pile and will keep us warm during the winter months. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and here are some more videos you may like.